Sometimes the person who saves your life is the last person you'd ever listen to. Sometimes pride stands between a man and the truth that could keep him breathing. Winter 1891, a small frontier town called Bellriver. Tamzen Doyle walks into a saloon wearing mud-caked boots and a torn coat. She's a widow, a mountain woman, an herbalist most folks dismiss without a second thought. But she sees something on Silas Greer's face that makes her blood run cold. Red patterns spreading across his skin. She's seen it before in the mining camps. 5 men dead already. Silas is wealthy, respected, recently widowed himself. He waves her away. The town laughs at her warning. But Tamsin slams her hand on his table and tells him exactly how many days he has left. Will he listen before it's too late? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years before that moment in the saloon, Tamzen Doyle buried her husband on a hillside overlooking the valley where they'd built their life together. Patrick Rourke had been a quiet man, steady as the pines that surrounded their cabin, and when the tuberculosis took him, it did so slowly enough that she had time to memorize every line of his face, every inflection of his voice. She tried everything she knew, every remedy her grandmother had taught her, every combination of herbs and tinctures she documented in her journals. Nothing worked. Some sicknesses, she learned, were beyond even the most careful hands. After Patrick died, she kept his name off her door, started using her grandmother's surname instead. Doyle felt safer somehow, less exposed. People in the mountain settlements knew her as the herb woman, the widow who could set bones and ease fevers, but they didn't know much else. She preferred it that way. Knowledge was currency in these isolated places, and she'd learned that women who knew too much often paid for it. Her cabin sat 2 hours' ride from Bellriver, tucked into a clearing where the morning sun hit just right. Patrick had chosen the spot. He'd built the cabin with his own hands, cutting each log, notching each corner. The walls still smelled of pine pitch in summer. Inside, Tamsin had lined the walls with shelves, rough-cut planks that held her collection. Dried herbs hung in bundles from the rafters. Roots and barks filled clay jars. Glass bottles contained tinctures, labeled in her careful script. Her journals occupied an entire shelf. 12 years of observations and treatments, sketches of plants, notes on symptoms and outcomes. Patrick had helped her with those, his neat handwriting filling the margins with additional details she dictated while her hands were busy with mixing or grinding. She made her living treating the scattered families who lived in the mountains and the occasional prospector or trapper who showed up at her door with a knife wound or a broken finger. Sometimes people from Bellriver came up the trail to fetch her when Dr. Pemberton couldn't help them or when they couldn't afford his fees. She never turned anyone away. Money was scarce, but people paid what they could. A dressed chicken, a sack of cornmeal, a cord of firewood. She managed. But lately she'd been hearing stories that troubled her. Miners from the camps up in the high country had started coming down with a sickness that made no sense. It started with tingling in the fingers and toes, a burning sensation under the skin. Then came the red patterns, like someone had drawn lines across their faces and hands with a hot poker. The burning got worse. Men lost feeling in their extremities. Some lost fingers and toes to gangrene. A few died. The camp doctor, an old drunk named Harrison, had no idea what caused it. He blamed bad water, bad air, moral weakness. The usual nonsense doctors blamed when they didn't know the answer. Tamsin had seen one of the afflicted miners. He'd ridden down from the camps in agony, begging for help. The patterns on his skin were unmistakable. She'd seen them once before, years ago, in a medical text her grandmother had owned. Ergot poisoning. St. Anthony's fire, they called it in the old country. It came from eating grain infected with a particular fungus. The fungus produced compounds that constricted blood vessels, cutting off circulation. In severe cases, limbs turned black and fell off. In the worst cases, people died. She'd asked the miner about his food. He told her they'd been eating bread made from rye flour, dark and dense, purchased from a supplier who'd given them a good price on a large shipment. When she asked to see the flour, he brought her a sack. She'd broken open the grains and found the telltale dark structures, ergot sclerotia, the fungal bodies that replaced the normal grain kernels. The evidence was clear. She'd treated the minor as best she could. Herbs to improve circulation, poultices to prevent infection, but the damage was already done. He'd lost 3 fingers on his left hand. When he recovered enough to travel, he went back up to warn the others. But by then, 5 men were dead. Tamsin spent weeks investigating, riding between mining camps, asking questions. She learned that the contaminated rye had come from a bad harvest back east, sold cheap to a grain supplier named Hewitt, who'd shipped it west. Hewitt had known the grain was questionable. No one bought rye that dark and dense, unless they were desperate or ignorant. He'd sold it anyway, mostly to the mining camps where men ate what they could get and didn't ask questions. But Hewitt had also sold grain to the general store in Bellriver. 2 weeks ago, Tamsin had ridden into town and checked the store's stock. There it was. Sacks of the same dark rye, the same ergot-infected grain that had killed men in the camps. She tried to warn the storekeeper, a man named Calhoun. He'd laughed at her, told her to stop spreading panic, said the grain was fine. He'd been selling it for weeks, and nobody had complained. She'd tried the town doctor next. Dr. Pemberton had an office on Main Street, a proper physician with a degree from a medical college back east. He'd listened to her with barely concealed contempt, his eyes never quite meeting hers. When she finished explaining about the ergot, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand. Said she was an uneducated woman peddling folk remedies and fear. Told her not to bother him again with superstitious nonsense. That left her with few options. She could warn people individually, but most wouldn't listen. Or she could go to someone with enough influence to make the town pay attention. Someone whose illness would matter. Silas Greer was the wealthiest man in Bellriver. He owned shares in the railroad that connected the town to the wider world. He'd invested in the lumber mills, the grain warehouses, the freight companies. When Silas spoke, people listened. And 2 days ago, when Tamsin had seen him walking down Main Street, she'd noticed the red patterns beginning to show on his face. Silas Greer had come to Bellriver 10 years earlier with Eastern money and Western ambition. He'd seen opportunity in the growing frontier town. Timber to be harvested, grain to be shipped, fortunes to be made. He'd built his success carefully, investing wisely, cultivating relationships, maintaining a reputation for fairness and integrity. He'd married a woman named Catherine, a quiet beauty who'd brought him happiness and stability. They'd been planning for children. Catherine had died 6 months ago in childbirth. The baby, a boy, had died with her. Silas had buried them together in the cemetery on the hill and thrown himself into work. It was the only thing that kept him moving forward. Every morning he checked his gold pocket watch. Catherine had given it to him on their first anniversary, had his initials engraved on the case, hers on the inside cover. Every time he opened it, he saw her handwriting. It was a wound that wouldn't heal, but he'd learned to live with it. The town respected Silas. He was careful with his business dealings, paid his workers fairly, contributed to the church and the school. He lived in a modest house by Bellriver standards, not the mansion some expected of a man of his means. He ate his meals at the boarding house or the saloon, worked late most nights, kept his grief private. He'd noticed the tingling in his fingers 3 days ago. Thought it was the cold. Montana winters were brutal, and he'd been spending long hours at the freight office reviewing contracts. Then came the burning sensation, subtle at first, then more insistent. He'd ignored it. Men his age dealt with aches and pains. It meant nothing. This morning, shaving before his mirror, he'd seen the red lines, faint but visible, spreading across his left cheek like the branches of a tree. He'd stared at them, uncertain what they meant. Probably just irritation from the cold wind. He'd splashed water on his face and gone to the saloon for breakfast. That's where Tamzen Doyle found him. The saloon at midday was half empty. A few card players, some mill workers on their break, the usual collection of men with nowhere else to be. Silas sat at his customary table near the window, reading the week-old newspaper from Denver, drinking coffee. He sensed her before he saw her. A shift in the room's atmosphere, conversations dropping off. He looked up. She stood just inside the door, snow melting off her coat, her grey eyes scanning the room until they found him. She walked straight to his table. Her boots left muddy prints on the floor. Up close, he could see the wear on her, the lines around her eyes, the rough hands, the coat that had been mended too many times. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 40, but life had not been gentle with her. "Mr. Greer," she said. Her voice was low, controlled. "My name is Tamzen Doyle. I need you to listen to me very carefully." He set down his newspaper. "I'm acquainted with your reputation, Mrs. Doyle. If you're looking for charity, I'm looking to save your life." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat without invitation. The room had gone completely silent now. "Those marks on your face. You've been eating bread from Calhoun's store, haven't you? Dark rye bread?" His hand moved unconsciously to his cheek. "I don't see how my eating habits concern you." "They concern you. That bread is poisoned. Not intentionally, but poisoned all the same. There's a fungus in the grain called ergot. It produces compounds that shut down your blood vessels. First you feel tingling, then burning. Then the red patterns appear. Then your fingers and toes start to die. Then you die." She leaned forward. "I've seen 5 men die from this in the mining camps. I've traced the grain back to Calhoun's store. And now I'm seeing the same symptoms on you." Silas studied her face. She believed what she was saying, that much was clear. But the story was absurd. Poisoned grain, fungus causing red patterns? It sounded like something from a penny dreadful. "Mrs. Doyle, I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly healthy. These marks are nothing, just a bit of irritation. You'll be dead in 3 weeks if you don't stop eating that bread and start treatment." Her voice was flat, matter of fact. "Maybe less, depending on how much you've consumed." Around them, men were starting to murmur. Someone laughed. Silas felt his face flush. This woman had humiliated him in front of the entire town, walked in off the mountain with mud on her boots, and started making wild accusations. "I think you should leave," he said quietly. She didn't move. Her hand went to a leather pouch at her belt, worn smooth with age and use. She pulled it onto the table. "This is my medicine bag. My grandmother gave it to me. Inside are herbs that can help you if you start now. Hawthorn to open your vessels, ginger for circulation, cayenne to warm your blood. I can mix you a tincture that will slow the damage, maybe even reverse it if we're fortunate. I don't need your folk remedies." Silas stood. The entire saloon was watching. "I'm going to ask you once more to leave. If you don't, I'll have the sheriff remove you." Tamsin looked up at him, and for a moment he saw something in her eyes that gave him pause. Not fear, not anger, sorrow. She stood slowly, picked up her medicine pouch and walked to the door. At the threshold she turned back. 3 weeks, Mr. Greer, maybe less. When the burning gets worse, when you can't feel your fingers anymore, when the fear sets in, you know where to find me." Then she was gone, leaving only muddy footprints and a room full of men trying to decide if what they'd just witnessed was tragedy or comedy. Silas sat back down. His coffee had gone cold. He touched his cheek again, felt the slight roughness of the red patterns under his fingertips. His hands were shaking. Someone at the bar made a joke about crazy mountain women. Someone else laughed. The card game resumed. Life in the saloon returned to normal. But Silas sat very still, staring at the muddy footprints that led from the door to his table and back again, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. That night, Silas couldn't sleep. The burning in his hands had intensified. He lay in bed, holding his fingers up to the moonlight streaming through the window, watching them tremble. The sensation was like holding them too close to a fire, constant, insistent, impossible to ignore. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, tried to remember what he'd eaten that day, what he'd touched, anything that might explain this sudden discomfort. The dark rye bread. He'd been eating it for 2 weeks, maybe 3. Calhoun had recommended it, said it was hearty fare, good for the cold months. Silas had bought a loaf every few days. It was dense, almost black, with a slightly bitter taste. He'd assumed that was normal for rye. He rose before dawn, dressed in the dark, and walked to his office. The freight company occupied a 2-story building on the edge of town, near the railroad depot. His desk faced a window that looked out over the loading platforms. He spent the early morning reviewing shipping manifests, trying to focus on the columns of numbers, but his mind kept drifting back to Tamzen Doyle's words. 5 men dead. The same symptoms. The same bread. At 8 o'clock, he had a meeting with his business partners, 3 men who'd invested in the railroad expansion. They discussed routes, schedules, profit margins. Silas tried to concentrate, but his hands kept cramping. He hid them under the table, flexing his fingers, trying to restore feeling. One of the partners noticed. "You all right, Silas? You look pale." "Fine, just tired." He forced a smile and steered the conversation back to business. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When his partners left, Silas sat alone in his office and stared at his hands. The numbness was spreading. He could still move his fingers, but the sensation was muted, as if he were wearing thick gloves. He tried to pick up a pen and write. The letters came out shaky, uneven. He thought about seeing Dr. Pemberton, but pride stopped him. If he went to the doctor complaining about tingling and burning, Pemberton would examine him, find nothing obviously wrong, and send him home with some platitude about stress and overwork. And word would spread. Silas Greer, the railroad investor, going to the doctor because of a little discomfort. The same man who dismissed the mountain woman's warning just yesterday. Instead, he locked his office and walked to Calhoun's general store. The store smelled of coffee and tobacco, and the earthy scent of grain stored in burlap sacks. Calhoun stood behind the counter, measuring out sugar for an elderly woman. He nodded at Silas, finished with his customer, then came over wearing his usual merchant smile. "Morning, Mr. Greer. What can I do for you?" "That rye bread you've been selling. Where does the grain come from?" A Calhoun's smile faltered slightly. "Well, now that's an odd question. Why do you ask?" "Just curious. I've been eating it regularly. Wanted to know the source. Supplier named Hewitt. Out of Billings. Good prices, reliable delivery. Why? Is there a problem with the bread?" Silas watched Calhoun's face carefully. The man seemed genuinely puzzled, not defensive. "Have you heard any complaints? Anyone getting sick after eating it?" "Sick? No, nothing like that. Why would—" Calhoun stopped. His eyes narrowed. "Is this about that mountain woman? She was in here last week spouting nonsense about poisoned grain. I told her to take her superstitions elsewhere. What exactly did she say?" "Something about fungus in the rye. Claimed it would make people sick, maybe kill them. I showed her my stock, told her I'd been selling it for a month with no issues. She insisted I destroy it all. Can you imagine? Destroy perfectly good inventory because of some old wives' tale?" Calhoun shook his head. "I sent her on her way. Didn't think she'd start bothering my customers, too. Do you still have the grain?" "Course I do. Got 24 sacks in the warehouse out back. You want to see it?" Silas followed Calhoun through the store to the rear warehouse. The space was dim, lit by high windows. Sacks of grain lined the walls, wheat, corn, barley, and in the far corner the rye. Calhoun pulled one sack forward, untied the top, and scooped out a handful of dark kernels. "See? Nothing wrong with it. Dark color is normal for rye from a wet harvest. Makes for denser bread, but some folks prefer it that way." Silas took some of the grain in his hand. The kernels were darker than any rye he'd seen before, almost black in places. He broke one open between his thumb and forefinger. Inside, instead of the normal white interior, he saw a purple-gray structure, hard and elongated. His stomach turned over. He'd seen something similar once before, years ago, in a textbook. He'd been reading about historical famines, trying to understand commodity markets and crop failures. There'd been a section on ergot poisoning, illustrated with drawings of infected grain. The description had been memorable because of how horrific it was. People losing limbs, going mad, dying in agony. The fungus replaced the grain kernels with toxic structures that looked exactly like what he was holding in his hand. "Mr. Greer, you feeling all right? You've gone white as a sheet." Silas dropped the grain back into the sack. His heart was hammering. "How much of this have you sold?" "I don't know, maybe half my stock." "Why? Who bought it?" Mostly mill workers, some families on the edge of town. The Johnsons, the Pratts, few others. And you, of course. You've been my most regular customer for the bread." Calhoun was starting to look worried now. "Mr. Greer, what's this about?" Silas didn't answer. He walked out of the warehouse, out of the store, into the cold morning air. He stood on the wooden sidewalk, breathing hard, his mind racing. Tamzen Doyle had been right. The grain was poisoned, and he'd been eating it for weeks. He looked down at his hands. The red patterns were spreading up his wrists now. The burning was worse, and underneath it all a deeper fear. How much damage had already been done? How much of the poison was already in his system? He walked home, packed a small bag, and tried to think clearly. He could go to Dr. Pemberton, but Pemberton had already dismissed Tamsin's warning. The doctor wouldn't believe it until someone died, and by then it would be too late. Silas had maybe days, maybe less, before the symptoms became severe. He needed help now, which meant he needed to swallow his pride and ride up to that cabin in the mountains. He saddled his horse just after noon. The trail to Tamsin's cabin was well marked but steep. Snow covered the ground, in patches, making the footing treacherous. The ride took nearly 2 hours. By the time he reached the clearing, his hands were so numb he could barely hold the reins. The cabin looked exactly as he'd imagined, small, weathered, smoke rising from the chimney. A shed stood nearby, probably for storing herbs and supplies. The place had a lived-in quality, not quite tidy, but organized in a way that spoke of someone who knew where everything was. He dismounted and walked to the door. Before he could knock, it opened. Tamsin stood there, wrapped in a shawl, unsurprised to see him. "Took you longer than I expected," she said. "Most men come running when they can't feel their fingers anymore. You held out almost a full day. Stubborn or brave, I'm not sure which." "I checked the grain," Silas said. His voice sounded hollow to his own ears. "You were right. I usually am about these things." "Doesn't mean people listen," she stepped aside. "Come in. Let me look at you properly." He entered the cabin. It was warmer inside, heated by a cast-iron stove. The smell of dried herbs was overwhelming at first, then oddly comforting. The walls were lined with shelves, exactly as he'd heard. Jars and bottles and bundles of plants he couldn't name. A work table occupied the center of the room, covered with mortars and pestles, cutting boards, scales for measuring. Everything was clean, organized with a precision that would have impressed any apothecary. Tamsin gestured to a chair near the stove. "Sit, show me your hands." He sat and held out his hands. She took them in hers, turning them over, studying the red patterns that now extended past his wrists. Her touch was gentle but clinical. She pressed her fingers against his pulse points, checking circulation. Her expression didn't change, but he saw something flicker in her eyes. "How much of the bread did you eat?" "A loaf every few days." "For about 3 weeks. How long since the symptoms started?" 3-4 days. Maybe longer. I wasn't paying attention at first." She released his hands and went to one of her shelves. She began pulling down jars, measuring out dried herbs and roots. "You're fortunate you came when you did." "Another week, and I'm not sure I could have helped you. As it is, the damage is significant. Your circulation is compromised. The ergot compounds are constricting your blood vessels, cutting off flow to your extremities. If we don't reverse this quickly, you'll start losing tissue." The clinical description frightened him more than any dramatic warning would have. "Can you reverse it?" "I can try. I've done it before once with a miner who caught it early. But you've ingested more than he did, and you're older. That makes it harder." She was mixing herbs as she spoke, working with practiced efficiency. "You'll need to stop eating the bread immediately, obviously, and you'll need to take this tincture 3 times a day. It tastes terrible, but it will open your vessels and improve blood flow. You'll also need poultices on your hands and feet to prevent infection if the tissue starts to break down." "How long until I know if it's working?" 3 days. Maybe 4. We'll know by then if your body can fight off the poison or if—" She stopped, looked at him directly. "Or if we need to prepare for worse outcomes." Silas felt the weight of it settle over him. Worse outcomes meant amputation, meant permanent damage, meant possible death. "Why did you come to warn me?" he asked. "You could have let me find out on my own." Tamsin finished mixing the tincture and poured it into a small bottle. "Because I've watched 5 men die from this, Mr. Greer, and I'm tired of burying people when I know I could have saved them if they'd just listened. You've got influence in this town. If you believe me, others might too. And that grain is still sitting in Calhoun's warehouse, waiting to poison more families. She handed him the bottle. Take a spoonful now, then ride back to town before dark. Come back tomorrow morning. We'll see how you respond to treatment. He took the bottle. The liquid inside was dark and smelled of bitter roots. He swallowed a spoonful and his face twisted. She hadn't been exaggerating about the taste. One more thing, Tamsin said as he stood to leave. You need to convince Calhoun to destroy that grain. All of it. And you need to find out who else has been eating it. Because you're not the only one who's sick, Mr. Greer. You're just the first one who matters enough for anyone to care. The truth of that hit him harder than anything else she'd said. He nodded, unable to find words, and walked out into the cold afternoon. The ride back to town felt longer than the ride up. His mind kept circling the same questions. How many others were sick? How many had died already without anyone noticing? And why had it taken a wealthy man's illness for anyone to pay attention? By the time he reached Bellriver, the sun was setting and he'd made a decision. Tomorrow, he would go back to Calhoun's store. And this time, he wouldn't take no for an answer. Silas arrived at Tamzin's cabin just after sunrise. He'd spent a restless night, his hands alternating between burning and numbness, his mind cataloguing every sensation, trying to determine if the tincture was working. The taste had lingered in his mouth all evening, bitter and medicinal. He'd taken the second dose before bed, and the third that morning. So far he couldn't tell if anything had changed. Tamsin was already awake, working at her table when he knocked. She opened the door, holding a mortar and pestle, her sleeves rolled up, a dusting of green powder on her hands. "You're early," she said. "That's good. Shows you're taking this seriously." She set down her tools and gestured him inside. "Let me see your hands." He held them out. In the morning light streaming through the window, the red patterns looked darker, more pronounced. His heart sank. Tamsin examined them carefully, pressing her fingers along his palms, his wrists, checking circulation. She didn't speak for a long moment. "The patterns are worse," Silas said. "The patterns always get worse before they get better. The poison is still in your system. It takes time to work its way out." She released his hands and went to her shelves. "But your circulation is slightly improved. I can feel it in your pulse. The tincture is working. Slowly but working." Relief flooded through him. How slowly?" "Weeks, possibly. This isn't something that resolves overnight, Mr. Greer. You're asking your body to fight off a poison that's been accumulating for 3 weeks. That takes time and patience." She pulled down another jar, this one filled with a thick paste. "This is for the patterns. Apply it twice daily. It will help reduce inflammation and improve blood flow to the surface vessels." She handed him the jar, then went to a shelf near the window and pulled down a stack of leather-bound journals. She brought them to the table and opened one. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, sketches of plants, detailed notes on symptoms and treatments. "These are my case records," she said. "Every patient I've treated for the past 12 years. Here." She turned to a page dated 3 years earlier. "This was the first ergot case I ever saw. A trapper named Moss. He'd been eating contaminated bread for a month before he came to me. The patterns covered both hands, both feet. He'd lost feeling in his toes." Silas leaned closer to study the page. The sketch showed hands covered in the same branching red lines he saw on his own skin. The notes were meticulous. Dates, dosages, symptoms, progression of treatment. What happened to him? He lived. Lost 2 toes, but he lived. The treatment worked, but it took 6 weeks. She turned to another page. "This was the miner I mentioned yesterday. He came to me earlier in the progression. 5 weeks of treatment, full recovery except for 3 fingers that had already turned gangrenous." She showed him page after page, cases of poisoning, infection, broken bones, fevers, each one documented with the same careful attention to detail. Her handwriting was neat and precise. In the margins, another hand had added notes in a different script, slightly more flowing. "Your husband?" Silas asked, pointing to the marginal notes. "Yes, Patrick. He helped me keep records. He had better penmanship than I did, and he noticed things I sometimes missed. Details about how patients moved, what they said, small changes that turned out to be significant." Her voice softened slightly. He wasn't a healer himself, but he understood the work, respected it. Silas looked around the cabin with new appreciation. This wasn't just a mountain woman's herb collection. This was a medical practice, as legitimate as any doctor's office, built on years of careful observation and documentation. "Why didn't you show these to Dr. Pemberton?" he asked. "This is evidence, proof that you know what you're doing." Tamzin's expression hardened. "I tried. 3 years ago, when I first came to Bellriver, I offered to share my knowledge, to work with him on difficult cases. He looked at my journals for about 5 minutes, then told me that anecdotal observations from an uneducated woman weren't the same as proper medical training. He said if I continued practicing medicine without a license, he'd have the sheriff arrest me. But you kept practicing. I kept helping people who asked for help. There's a difference." She closed the journal and set it aside. "Most of my patients are people Pemberton won't treat, too poor, too far away, too difficult. Or people he can't help because his medical training doesn't cover what ails them. I don't advertise. I don't charge set fees. I just do what I can." Silas was quiet for a moment, processing this. He'd dismissed her yesterday in the saloon because she didn't fit his idea of what a medical professional should look like. He'd been wrong, completely arrogantly wrong. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for yesterday, for not listening. You don't owe me anything except to take your medicine and follow my instructions, and to help me stop anyone else from eating that grain." She moved back to her work table and began preparing another mixture. "Did you speak to Calhoun?" "Not yet. I came here first." He paused. "I've been thinking about the supply chain. You said the grain came from a supplier named Hewitt in Billings." "That's what I was told. My railroad company transported grain shipments from Billings to Bellriver 3 months ago. Large quantities, multiple cars. I reviewed the manifests last night." He felt his stomach tighten as he said it. "If Hewitt used our rail line, then my company facilitated this." Tamsin looked at him sharply. "You didn't know the grain was contaminated?" "No, but I should have. We're supposed to inspect shipments, verify quality. That's part of the contract. If we'd done our job properly, this grain would never have made it to Bellriver. The weight of it settled on him like a physical burden. Those 5 men who died in the mining camps, if our inspectors had caught the contamination, they'd still be alive. You can't think like that. You'll drive yourself mad with guilt over things you couldn't have known, but I can know now. And I can do something about it." Silas stood. "I'm going to buy every sack of that grain from Calhoun. All of it. And I'm going to burn it. Then I'm going to trace back through the supply chain and find out exactly how contaminated grain made it through our inspection process. That will cost you. I don't care what it costs. This is my responsibility now." Tamsin studied him for a long moment. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Greer." "What did you expect?" "A proud man who'd protect his interests above all else. Someone who'd try to cover this up to save his reputation and his business." She smiled slightly. "I'm glad to be wrong. I was that man yesterday," Silas admitted. "But spending a night wondering if you're going to lose your fingers tends to change your perspective." He took the jar of paste and the bottle of tincture. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "How did you know to look for ergot? What made you suspect the grain?" "My grandmother. She came from the old country, from a place where ergot poisoning was common enough that people had learned to recognize it. She taught me the signs, showed me what infected grain looked like. When I saw those first miners with the red patterns, I knew what I was seeing. It's not something you forget once you've learned it." She crossed her arms. "Knowledge like that gets passed down through generations, Mr. Greer, usually through women. Midwives, herbalists, healers. We remember things that formal medicine forgets." Silas nodded slowly. "I'm beginning to understand that." He rode back to town thinking about knowledge and who was allowed to possess it. About all the wisdom that was dismissed because it came from the wrong source, in the wrong voice. About how close he'd come to dying because he'd been too proud to listen to someone who knew more than he did. When he reached Bellriver, his first stop was the general store. Calhoun was sweeping the front steps. He looked up as Silas dismounted. "Mr. Greer, back again so soon?" I need to talk to you about that rye grain. Inside, if you don't mind." Calhoun's expression shifted to wariness, but he nodded and led the way into the store. Silas closed the door behind them and turned to face the merchant. "That grain is poisoned," Silas said without preamble. "It's contaminated with ergot fungus. It's already made me sick, and it's going to sicken everyone else who's been eating it. I need you to stop selling it immediately, and I need a list of everyone who bought it from you." Calhoun's face went pale. "Mr. Greer, that's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation. It's a fact. I've seen the evidence. I've consulted with someone who knows what they're looking at. And I'm currently being treated for ergot poisoning because I ate your bread." He held up his hands, showed Calhoun the red patterns. "See these? This is what the fungus does. And it gets worse. Much worse." Calhoun stared at Silas's hands, his mouth slightly open. "I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know. I believe you. But now you do know, and that means you have a responsibility to act. I want to buy all the remaining grain from you. Every sack. I'll pay you twice what you paid for it, and I'll dispose of it safely. But you need to give me that list of buyers. We need to warn them before anyone else gets seriously ill." The merchant stood frozen for a moment, then nodded slowly. "The Johnson family bought 2 sacks. The Pratts bought 1. Miller, the foreman at the lumber mill, bought 3 for his boarding house." He paused, thinking. "Maybe 8 or 10 others. I can check my ledger." "Do it now, please." While Calhoun went to get his records, Silas looked out the front window at the street. Bellriver going about its morning business, unaware that poison was already working its way through the town. How many people were feeling the first symptoms right now? How many were ignoring the tingling, the burning, telling themselves it was nothing? And how many would listen when he tried to warn them? By mid-afternoon, Silas had visited 6 families. The responses varied from disbelief to outright hostility. The Johnsons thanked him politely, but insisted they felt fine. The Pratts accused him of trying to scare them into buying more expensive grain. Miller, the mill foreman, slammed the door in his face after calling him a puppet for that witch woman from the mountains. Only one family took him seriously, a young widow named Louisa, who lived on the edge of town with her 2 small children. She'd bought a single sack of rye flour 2 weeks earlier. When Silas showed her his hands and explained about the ergot, her face went white. "My son," she said. "Thomas, he's been complaining that his hands hurt. I thought he'd just been playing too rough." She grabbed Silas's arm. Will he get him to Tamzen Doyle's cabin? Today, if you can manage it. She can help him if you catch it early enough." Louisa nodded, already calling for her children. Silas left her his horse with directions to the cabin and continued his rounds on foot. By evening, he was exhausted and discouraged. He'd warned everyone on Calhoun's list, but only Louisa had believed him. The others would come around eventually, when their symptoms worsened, when they couldn't ignore the burning anymore. But by then, the damage would be worse, harder to treat, maybe impossible. He stopped at the boarding house for supper, ate mechanically without tasting the food. His hands ached. The tincture helped, but the pain was still there, a constant reminder of what he'd nearly lost through stubbornness. Dr. Pemberton came in halfway through the meal. The doctor spotted Silas and walked over, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Greer, I heard you've been making the rounds today with some alarming stories about poisoned grain. Not stories, facts." "I see." Pemberton sat down uninvited. "You're a respected man in this community. People listen to you, which is why I'm asking you, as a professional courtesy, to stop spreading panic based on the superstitious claims of an uneducated mountain woman." Silas set down his fork. "Have you examined the grain?" "I don't need to examine grain. I'm a physician, not a farmer." "Then examine this." Silas held up his hands. The red patterns had spread further, now visible past his shirt cuffs. "Ergot poisoning. I've been eating Calhoun's bread for 3 weeks. These are the symptoms, and they're going to get worse unless I continue treatment." Pemberton leaned forward, studying Silas's hands with professional interest despite his dismissive words. "That could be any number of conditions. Dermatitis, perhaps. An allergic reaction. It's hardly evidence of poisoning. 5 men died in the mining camps with these exact symptoms. Tamzen Doyle treated them. She documented everything in her case journals. She tried to warn you, tried to warn Calhoun, tried to warn the town. Nobody listened. And now it's spreading here. Case journals. Pemberton's voice was thick with contempt. Anecdotal observations from someone with no medical training. That's not evidence, Mr. Greer. That's folklore. She has 12 years of documented cases. Detailed notes on symptoms, treatments, outcomes. Her records are more thorough than most doctors I've encountered. Silas leaned forward. And her treatment is working. My circulation is improving. The burning is less severe. She knows what she's doing, even if she doesn't have a diploma from a medical college. And if her treatment fails, if your condition worsens, who will you sue for malpractice? You can't hold a mountain herbalist accountable in a court of law. If her treatment fails, I'll die. But at least I'll die knowing I tried something, instead of sitting around waiting for you to acknowledge that maybe, possibly there's something to her warning. Silas stood. I'm done arguing about this. Believe what you want. But when more people start showing symptoms, and they will, don't say you weren't warned. He left the boarding house and walked toward his own home, the cold night air biting at his face. His hands throbbed. He was tired, angry, frustrated by the sheer, stubborn blindness of people who would rather cling to their assumptions than face an uncomfortable truth. At his house, he found a horse tied to the post. Louisa's horse. And sitting on his front steps, wrapped in a shawl against the cold, was Tamsin. Mrs. Doyle, I didn't expect. Louisa came to see me this afternoon. With her son. Tamsin stood. The boy is sick, but I caught it early. He'll be fine. She told me about your rounds today. About how nobody believed you. 1 family out of 10. Not exactly a successful campaign. 1 family is better than none. That's 1 child who won't lose his fingers. That's something. She looked at him appraisingly. You look exhausted. I am. Let me see your hands. They went inside. Silas lit a lamp while Tamsin examined his hands by the warm light. Her touch was gentle, professional. She nodded to herself. The tincture is working. The patterns aren't spreading as fast, and your circulation is definitely better. She released his hands. But you need to rest. You're pushing yourself too hard. There are still families who haven't been warned. People who are eating that grain right now, and they'll continue eating it no matter what you say until they feel the symptoms themselves. You can't save people who don't want to be saved, Mr. Greer. I learned that lesson a long time ago. She moved to his window, looked out at the dark street. The best you can do is be there when they finally come around. When they're ready to listen. That's not enough. It's all any of us can do. She turned back to him. I brought you a fresh supply of tincture, and I wanted to check on you. Make sure you were following the treatment properly. Why? The question came out more bluntly than he intended. I was rude to you in the saloon. I dismissed you in front of the entire town. Why do you care if I follow the treatment? Tamsin was quiet for a moment. Because you came back. Because when faced with evidence, you changed your mind. Because you're trying to warn others, even though it cost you socially. She paused. And because I'm tired of watching people die from things I know how to treat. Every person I save, that's 1 less ghost keeping me up at night. There was something in her voice, a depth of weariness that spoke of more than just frustration with stubborn patience. Silas recognized it because he felt it himself. The weight of loss. The burden of things that couldn't be fixed, your husband, he said quietly. The tuberculosis. You couldn't save him. No, I tried everything. Every remedy I knew, every treatment I'd ever documented. Nothing worked. I watched him fade for 8 months. By the end, he could barely breathe. She wrapped her arms around herself. That's when I learned the hardest lesson. Sometimes knowledge isn't enough. Sometimes you can do everything right and still lose. I'm sorry. So am I. She straightened, seemed to shake off the memory. But that's why I do this. Why I keep trying. Because even if I can't save everyone, I can save some. And that has to be enough, Silas understood. After Catherine died, he'd thrown himself into work for the same reason. Because doing something, anything, was better than sitting still with grief. Because maybe if he worked hard enough, built enough, succeeded enough, it would somehow balance the scales. "The grain I bought from Calhoun," he said. "I'm burning it tomorrow, all 24 sacks. I'd appreciate it if you'd be there to verify that it's done properly, that there's no risk of contamination spreading. I'll be there. And after that, I need to trace the supply chain. Find out how this happened, who's responsible, what safeguards failed. My railroad company was involved in transporting that grain. I need to know if we were negligent, if we could have prevented this." He met her eyes. "If you're willing, I could use your expertise to identify other contaminated shipments, to help me understand what to look for. That would require spending time in town, working with you publicly. People won't like that. People don't have to like it. They just have to accept it." He managed a tired smile. "Besides, my reputation is already damaged. What's a little more scandal?" Tamsin studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. We'll do this together. But you're still following the treatment schedule. 3 doses a day, no exceptions. And if your symptoms worsen at all, you tell me immediately." Agreed. She left him with the fresh bottle of tincture and instructions to get a full night's sleep. After she was gone, Silas sat in his quiet house and looked at his hands. The red patterns were still there, still visible, still a reminder of how close he'd come to disaster. But they weren't spreading as fast. The treatment was working. He thought about Tamsin riding back up to her cabin in the dark, a woman who'd spent 3 years alone on a mountain, tending to her grief and her herbs, asking nothing from anyone. And now she was riding down into town, into the teeth of skepticism and hostility, to help people who didn't want her help. She was braver than he'd ever been. And tomorrow he'd try to be worthy of that bravery. They burned the grain at dawn, behind Calhoun's warehouse, where the smoke wouldn't alarm the whole town. Tamsin supervised the process, making sure the fire was hot enough to destroy the ergot completely. Silas watched $2,000 of inventory turn to ash and felt nothing but relief. 3 days later, Miller the mill foreman came down with symptoms. Then one of the Johnson sons. Then a family Silas hadn't even known about. They'd bought flour from a traveling peddler who'd gotten it from Calhoun. The cases accumulated slowly but steadily, a creeping confirmation of everything Tamsin had warned about. The town called a meeting. The courthouse was packed. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls, crowding the doorway. Mayor Hoskins presided from the bench, his face grave. Dr. Pemberton sat beside him, looking uncomfortable. Calhoun sat in the front row, wringing his hands. And Silas sat next to Tamsin, very deliberately, making his allegiance clear. The mayor called the meeting to order. "We're here to address the growing concern about illness in our community. Several families have reported symptoms consistent with..." He glanced at his notes. "What Mrs. Doyle has identified as ergot poisoning. Dr. Pemberton, would you care to comment?" Pemberton stood, cleared his throat. "I have examined several of the afflicted individuals. Their symptoms are indeed consistent with ergotism, though I hesitate to make a definitive diagnosis without further evidence. However, out of an abundance of caution, I recommend that we investigate the grain supply and take appropriate measures." The careful, hedged language annoyed Silas. Pemberton was protecting himself, positioning for whichever way the wind blew. But at least he wasn't openly opposing Tamsin anymore. "Mrs. Doyle," the mayor said, "you were the first to raise this alarm. Would you explain to the assembly what you found?" Tamsin stood, every eye in the room fixed on her. She didn't seem nervous, just tired. She'd been treating patients around the clock for the past 3 days. "Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains," she said. Her voice was calm, clear. "It produces compounds that constrict blood vessels. In small amounts, it causes tingling and burning. In larger amounts, it causes gangrene and death. The grain Mr. Calhoun purchased was heavily contaminated. I identified it immediately when I saw it. I tried to warn the store, warn the doctor, warn anyone who would listen. Nobody did. That's not entirely fair," Calhoun protested. "I had no way of knowing. You had me telling you the grain was poisoned. That's a way of knowing." Tamsin's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room. "I showed you the infected kernels. I explained what would happen. You chose not to believe me. You're a..." Calhoun stopped himself, but everyone knew what he'd been about to say. "A woman, an herbalist, not a real authority. She was right, Silas said, standing. I didn't believe her either at first. Then I got sick. Then I checked the grain myself and found exactly what she described. If I'd listened to her immediately, we could have prevented most of these cases. The fault is mine as much as anyone's. Mr. Greer has been remarkably courageous in taking responsibility, the mayor said diplomatically. But I think we need to focus on moving forward. What do we do now? Everyone who's eaten the bread needs to be examined, Tamsin said. Those with symptoms need immediate treatment. Those without symptoms need to be monitored. And we need to trace the grain supply to make sure there are no other contaminated shipments in the region. And who's going to pay for all this treatment? Someone shouted from the back. Some of us can't afford a doctor. I'm not charging for treatment, Tamsin said. I never have. Anyone who's sick can come to me. I'll do what I can. But you're not a licensed physician, Pemberton interjected. Legally, you can't practice medicine. Then legally, I'm just a neighbor helping neighbors, Tamsin shot back. Call it what you want. I'm doing it regardless. The mayor held up his hands. Let's not get bogged down in technicalities. The priority is helping the sick. If Mrs. Doyle is willing to provide treatment, and if Dr. Pemberton is willing to supervise, I don't need supervision, Tamsin said flatly. Nevertheless, the mayor continued, it would help ease concerns if Dr. Pemberton could verify your treatments, work with you to ensure the best outcomes. Pemberton looked like he'd bitten into something sour, but he nodded. In the interest of public health, I'm willing to collaborate. The meeting continued for another hour, establishing protocols, assigning responsibilities. Silas volunteered his freight office as a coordination center. He'd investigate the supply chain, work with Tamsin to identify other potential contamination, help transport patients who couldn't make the trip to her cabin. Others volunteered to help with food, firewood, whatever the sick families needed. By the time the meeting ended, the town had a plan. Not everyone was happy. Some still muttered about mountain witches and folk remedies, but the sheer weight of evidence had finally broken through the wall of skepticism. Outside the courthouse, Louisa approached them. She was holding her son's hand. The boy looked healthy, energetic, completely recovered. Mrs. Doyle, I wanted to thank you, Louisa said. Thomas is doing so much better. The treatment worked. Tamsin knelt down to the boy's level. Let me see your hands, Thomas. The boy held them out. The red patterns had faded to barely visible lines. His fingers were pink and warm, circulation fully restored. You're a lucky young man, Tamsin said. Your mother brought you to me quickly. That made all the difference. Are you really a witch? Thomas asked with the blunt curiosity of childhood. Thomas, Louisa was mortified. But Tamsin smiled. Some people think so. But no, I'm just someone who pays attention to plants and listens when people describe their symptoms. That's not magic. That's just being careful. As they walked away from the courthouse, Silas noticed how people looked at Tamsin differently now. Not with dismissal, but with something closer to respect. Still wary, still uncertain, but willing to listen. That went better than I expected, he said. It's a start. Though Pemberton is going to make everything more complicated. He's trying to cover himself. Doesn't want to look foolish for dismissing you initially. I don't care how he looks. I care about treating patients effectively. She stopped walking, turned to face him. Working with him means compromise. Justifying my methods, explaining every decision, proving myself over and over. I don't know if I have the patience for that. You have it. I've seen it, Silas smiled. You explained ergot poisoning to me 4 times before I finally understood. If you can be patient with me, you can handle Pemberton. She almost laughed. Fair point. They walked to Silas's office. He'd converted a storage room into a makeshift examination area, clean, warm, stocked with basic supplies. Tamsin had brought down her most essential herbs and remedies. For the next week, they'd be working out of town instead of the mountain cabin, treating patients as they came. The first one arrived within the hour, a mill worker, mid-30s, showing early symptoms. Tamsin examined him while Silas took notes, documenting everything the way she'd taught him. The worker was skeptical at first. Why should he trust a woman's treatment? But when Tamsin showed him the progression charts, explained exactly what was happening in his body, described the treatment protocol, he grudgingly agreed to try. More patients came, some from families Silas had warned days earlier, finally willing to admit they were sick. Others, who'd heard about the town meeting, decided to err on the side of caution. By evening, they'd treated 11 people. Dr. Pemberton showed up near closing, ostensibly to observe and learn. He watched Tamsin work for half an hour, his expression carefully neutral. Finally, he spoke. "Your diagnostic process is sound, and your treatment protocol appears to be effective based on the outcomes I've observed." The words came slowly, as if each one cost him. "I was wrong to dismiss your concerns initially. That was unprofessional of me." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was as close as Pemberton could manage. Tamsin accepted it with a brief nod. "I'd appreciate your input on the more severe cases," she said. "Some of these patients have complications beyond the ergot poisoning. That's where your training would be valuable." Pemberton seemed surprised by the offer. "Yes, of course. I'd be happy to collaborate." After he left, Silas remarked, "That was generous of you, offering to work with him after how he treated you. I don't have room for petty grudges. Too many people need help." Tamsin was cleaning her work area, organizing bottles and jars. "Besides, he does have knowledge I don't. Formal anatomy, surgical techniques, access to medications I can't make myself. If we can combine our skills, we'll do better work together than either of us could alone." Silas helped her pack up for the evening. As they worked in comfortable silence, he found himself watching her. The efficient way she moved, the care she took with even the smallest tasks. She'd rebuilt her life after Patrick's death by making herself useful, by channeling grief into purpose. He understood that strategy intimately. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to regardless. Why did you stay on the mountain after Patrick died? You could have moved to town, set up a practice here. Made your life easier." Tamsin was quiet for a long moment. "The mountain was where we built our life together. Leaving felt like abandoning him. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to be around people. After watching him die, after failing to save him, I needed time alone. Needed to remember that I was still useful, even if I couldn't save the one person who mattered most. But now you're here, in town. Now there's a reason to be here." She met his eyes. "And maybe I was lonely up there. Maybe I forgot that being useful means being where people can actually find you." The moment stretched between them, weighted with things neither of them was quite ready to say. Then Tamsin turned back to her work, and the moment passed. But something had shifted. Something neither of them could name yet, but both of them 2 weeks into the crisis. Silas made a decision that would cost him everything he'd built. The investigation into the grain supply had revealed uncomfortable truths. His railroad company had indeed transported the contaminated shipment from Billings. The inspection protocols they were supposed to follow had been skipped, not maliciously but through negligence. His freight manager had been overwhelmed, understaffed, cutting corners to meet deadlines. The contaminated grain had slipped through because no one had bothered to look carefully. Silas could have buried this information, could have blamed Hewitt, the supplier, and washed his hands of responsibility. His business partners were already urging him to settle quietly, pay some damages, move on. But every time he looked at his hands, still marked with fading red patterns, he remembered what it felt like to be poisoned, to feel his body failing, to face the possibility of losing fingers, limbs, life. He couldn't let that happen to others. Not if he could prevent it. So he went to the mayor with all his findings, laid out the whole supply chain, his company's role, the inspection failures, offered to pay damages to every affected family from his personal funds. It would cost him most of his savings, possibly his partnerships, certainly his reputation in railroad circles. The mayor looked at the documents spread across his desk and shook his head slowly. "Silas, you don't have to do this. Nobody's blaming you personally. I'm blaming myself." "That's enough." Word spread quickly. By evening, the whole town knew. Silas Greer, the railroad investor, admitting fault and financial responsibility. Some called it noble, others called it foolish. His business partners called an emergency meeting. They met in his office after dark. 3 men, all older than Silas, all furious. "You're destroying this company," Harrison Cole said. He was the primary investor, the man who'd brought Silas into the railroad business 10 years ago. "Admitting negligence opens us up to lawsuits, regulatory action, possibly criminal charges." "We were negligent," Silas said calmly. "That's not an admission. It's a fact we could have managed quietly. Instead, you've made us a public target." Cole slammed his hand on the desk. "I've built this company for 20 years. I'm not watching it collapse because you've developed a conscience. Then buy me out. I'll sell you my shares at a fair price and walk away. But I'm not covering this up." The other partners exchanged glances. Finally, Cole spoke. "We accept. Draw up the papers. As of tomorrow, you're no longer part of this company. And Silas," his voice was cold, "don't expect any references. You've burned every bridge you had in this industry." After they left, Silas sat alone in the office that would soon belong to someone else. He'd built his fortune through this company. Railroad investments had made him wealthy, respected, secure. Now he was walking away from it all. He felt lighter than he had in months. A knock at the door. Tamsin entered carrying a medical bag. "I saw lights. Figured you were still here." She looked at his face and her expression shifted. "What happened?" "I just sold my railroad shares. I'm effectively out of business as of tomorrow." She set down her bag. "Because of the grain shipment?" "Because I told the truth about our role in it. My partners didn't appreciate the honesty." He managed a wry smile. "Turns out integrity is expensive. I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was the right choice." He leaned back in his chair. "Catherine would have been proud. She always said I cared too much about what people thought, not enough about doing what was right." She was correct, as usual. It was the first time he'd mentioned his late wife, without pain shadowing his voice. Tamsin noticed. "You're healing," she said quietly. "Not just your hands. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just too tired to keep carrying all that grief and guilt." He stood, walked to the window. She wore no ring, had no past husband. She had a past she wanted to hide. A past that included poverty, hard labor, and a husband who died in the mining camps. Tamsin pulled out another document, a death certificate from the camp records. Jonathan Greer died in a mining accident 6 years ago, survived by his wife, Catherine. Silas stared at the certificate. The evidence was irrefutable. Catherine had been married before, had been a widow before she ever met him, had hidden that entire part of her life. "Why wouldn't she tell me?" His voice was barely a whisper. "For the same reason she hid her work in the camps. Because widows from mining accidents were poor, desperate, often ended up in unfortunate circumstances just to survive. She wanted to come to you fresh, untainted by that past. So she invented a new history and left the widow behind." Tamsin sat beside him. "I'm sorry. I know this is a shock. Was anything she told me true?" Her love for you was true. Her happiness with you was true. The rest was just a woman trying to survive in a world that judges women harshly for their circumstances." Tamsin paused. "There's more. The baby she was carrying when she died. I've been thinking about the timeline, about what she wrote in her letter. And I think there's a possibility, a small one, but a possibility, that the child wasn't conceived after your marriage." Silas felt like he couldn't breathe. "You're saying the baby was from before we met? From her first husband?" "I'm saying the dates are ambiguous. She might have been pregnant when she came to Bellriver. She might have married you quickly to give the child a legitimate father. Or the pregnancy might have been yours, conceived during those weeks you spent together at the camps. Either way, she kept the truth from you, so everything was a lie. Our entire marriage was built on deception." "No!" Tamsin's voice was firm. "Your marriage was built on love and hope and 2 people trying to make a life together. She lied about her past, yes. But she didn't lie about caring for you, about wanting to build something real with you. That was all genuine." Silas stood, paced to the window. Outside, Bellriver was quiet under a blanket of stars. He thought about Catherine, about all the times she'd seemed sad or distant, moments he'd attributed to natural melancholy. Had she been thinking about her first husband? About the life she'd left behind? About the secret she was keeping? "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. The hearing is tomorrow. This information, it doesn't change anything about the grain poisoning, about my company's negligence, because it changes everything about why I'm here." Tamsin stood, moved to stand beside him. "I came to Bellriver to warn about the poisoned grain. But I also came because I recognized Catherine's necklace in your photograph. I wanted to know what had happened to her, wanted to see if she'd found the happiness she was hoping for. And when I realized you were sick, when I realized I could save you, it felt like a second chance. Like maybe I could do for you what I couldn't do for her. You knew Catherine. You could have told me about her past weeks ago. I could have. But I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it. And honestly, I wasn't sure it was my place to tell. Those were Catherine's secrets to share or keep." Tamsin's voice wavered slightly. "But then I saw how much you've changed these past weeks. How you've chosen truth over comfort. How you've sacrificed your reputation and your fortune to do what's right. And I thought you deserved to know the whole truth. About Catherine. About who she really was. About how brave she had to be just to survive." Silas turned to look at her. In the dim lamplight, Tamsin's face was open, vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before. This woman who'd saved his life, who'd fought for truth when no one else would listen, who'd carried Catherine's secrets for years out of respect for the dead. "You loved her," he said suddenly. "Not romantically, but you cared about her. That's why you came to warn me. That's why you worked so hard to save me. I knew her for only a few months in the camps. But yes, I cared about her. She was kind to me when few others were. She had hope in a place where hope was scarce. When I got her letter years later, telling me she was happy, it mattered. It meant something that one of us had made it out, had found a good life." Tamsin's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "And when I realized you were sick, when I saw Catherine's widower about to die from the same kind of senseless tragedy that killed her first husband, I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let you die without fighting for you the way I wished I'd fought harder for her." The revelation hung between them. Silas understood now why Tamsin had been so insistent, so desperate to make him listen. She wasn't just trying to stop a poisoning outbreak. She was trying to save the man Catherine had loved, the life Catherine had built after escaping poverty and loss. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for telling me, for saving me, for caring enough about Catherine's memory to give me the truth. What will you do with this information?" "I don't know yet. Maybe nothing. Catherine's past is hers to keep, if that's what she wanted. Knowing the truth doesn't change how much I loved her, or how much she meant to me." He managed a small smile. "It just makes her braver than I ever realized. She survived things I can barely imagine, reinvented herself completely, built a new life from nothing. That takes extraordinary courage." "It does," Tamsin agreed. "The kind of courage most people never have to find." They stood together in silence, two people bound by connection to a woman who'd shaped both their lives. Catherine, who'd worked in the mining camps and learned to survive. Catherine, who'd become a seamstress and kept accounts and married a miner named Jonathan. Catherine, who'd been widowed young and refused to let that tragedy define her entire future. Catherine, who'd met a railroad investor and seen a chance for something better and been brave enough to reach for it, even if it meant hiding who she'd been. "She would have liked you," Silas said finally. "If she'd known you were in Bellriver, if she'd been able to be honest about her past, she would have sought you out, would have valued your friendship." "I would have valued hers too," Tamsin said. "And I value yours, Silas. What you've become, how you've changed, Catherine would be proud of you. I'm certain of it." The words settled something in him. Some piece of grief he hadn't known was still sharp. Catherine had loved him. She'd built a real life with him, even if parts of her past remained hidden. And now he had a chance to honor that love by being the kind of man she'd believed he could become. Honest, brave, willing to sacrifice comfort for truth. Tomorrow he'd testify at the hearing. He'd tell the whole truth about his company's negligence, about the inspection failures, about his own responsibility. It would cost him everything he'd built, but it was the right thing to do. And maybe somewhere Catherine was watching, proud of the man he'd finally become. "Stay," he said to Tamsin, "tonight. I don't mean anything improper, But it's late, and you've ridden all this way, and tomorrow will be difficult. Stay in the guest room. Let me make you tea. Let us face tomorrow together." Tamsin smiled, tired but genuine. All right. Yes, I'd like that." They sat together in his small kitchen, drinking tea, talking about Catherine and the hearing and the uncertain future. And for the first time since his wife had died, Silas felt like he wasn't facing the world alone. Morning came too quickly. Silas woke to find Tamsin already up, preparing her medical bag in case any of the patients needed attention during the hearing. She'd slept in Catherine's old clothing, a simple dress that fit reasonably well. Seeing her in his late wife's clothes should have felt strange, but instead it felt oddly right, as if Catherine had somehow given her blessing to whatever was developing between them. They ate a quiet breakfast. Neither spoke much. The weight of what was coming pressed down on both of them. At the courthouse, a crowd had already gathered. News of the hearing had spread beyond Bellriver. People from the mining camps had come down, some still showing the effects of ergot poisoning. Families who'd lost loved ones, workers from the railroad, lawyers and businessmen from as far as Helena. Everyone wanted to see how this would resolve. Silas saw his former business partners standing near the entrance. Harrison Cole caught his eye and looked away deliberately. The message was clear. Silas was on his own now. No support, no allies in the business community. He'd made his choice, and they'd made theirs. But when he looked around, he saw other faces. Louisa holding her healthy son's hand. The mill workers he'd warned about the grain. Families he'd helped, patients Tamsin had treated. They nodded at him, offered small smiles. Not everyone had abandoned him. Inside, the courthouse was packed. Judge Morrison presided, a stern man in his 60s, known for fairness and impatience with legal maneuvering. Hewitt, the grain supplier, sat with 3 lawyers at one table. Silas sat alone at another, having declined legal representation. He didn't need lawyers to tell the truth. Tamsin sat in the front row of the gallery, her medical journals stacked beside her. She'd be called to testify about the medical evidence. Dr. Pemberton sat a few rows back, looking uncomfortable. He'd submitted a written statement confirming the ergot diagnosis, but clearly preferred not to be directly involved. The judge called the proceedings to order. Hewitt's lead lawyer, a man named Thatcher, stood to present their case. He was good. Silas could see that immediately. He painted Hewitt as an innocent middleman, a businessman who'd purchased grain in good faith from Eastern suppliers and sold it in good faith to Western buyers. If the grain was contaminated, well, that was the supplier's fault. Hewitt had no way of knowing. He'd relied on the railroad's inspection process to catch any problems. And that inspection process failed catastrophically, Thatcher said, pointing at Silas. Mr. Greer's company was contracted to verify the quality of all shipments. They were paid handsomely for this service, yet they allowed contaminated grain to pass through without any examination whatsoever. The negligence was not my client's, it was the railroad's. It was the effective strategy. Shift all blame to the inspection failures, to the railroad's negligence, and technically, it wasn't wrong. Silas's company had failed in its duty. The judge turned to Silas. "Mr. Greer, you're representing yourself in this matter. Do you have a response?" Silas stood, every eye in the courtroom fixed on him. He thought about Catherine, about the courage it had taken her to reinvent herself, to risk everything for a chance at a better life. He thought about Tamsin, riding down from the mountain to warn a town that didn't want to hear the truth. Courage came in many forms. This was his moment to show it. "Your Honor, Mr. Thatcher is correct about one thing. My company's inspection process failed. We were supposed to examine all grain shipments for quality and safety. We didn't do that. We were understaffed, overwhelmed, cutting corners to meet deadlines. The contaminated grain passed through our facility without proper inspection." Murmurs ran through the courtroom. Thatcher looked surprised that Silas was admitting fault so readily. "However," Silas continued, "that doesn't absolve Mr. Hewitt of responsibility. He purchased grain that any experienced grain merchant would recognize as questionable. Rye that. Dark. that heavily infected with ergot sclerotia. That's not something you miss if you're paying attention. He bought it because it was cheap, and he sold it because it was profitable. He may not have intended to poison anyone, but he was certainly willing to ignore obvious warning signs to make money. Objection! Thatcher was on his feet. Mr. Greer is not a grain expert. He has no standing to judge what an experienced merchant should or shouldn't recognize. Sustained, the judge said. Mr. Greer, stick to facts within your knowledge. Yes, Your Honor. Silas pulled out a folder of documents. These are the shipping manifests from my company. They show exactly when the contaminated grain arrived, how it was logged, what inspections were supposed to occur. I've marked every place where our procedures broke down, where we failed to follow protocol. This is evidence of our negligence. I'm not trying to hide it. He handed the documents to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. Morrison examined them carefully, his expression unreadable. I'm also prepared to provide a full accounting of damages, Silas continued. Medical costs for affected families, lost wages, pain and suffering. I've calculated it as fairly as I can. The total comes to approximately $40,000. I'm prepared to pay that entire amount from my personal funds. The courtroom erupted. $40,000 was an enormous sum, more than most people saw in a lifetime. Thatcher was conferring urgently with Hewitt and his other lawyers. The judge banged his gavel for order. Mr. Greer, that's an unusually generous offer. Are you certain you've calculated correctly? I'm certain, Your Honor. And I'm certain it's the right thing to do. My company's negligence contributed to this tragedy. I'm taking responsibility for that. Even though accepting such responsibility may expose you to criminal liability. Even so, the judge studied Silas for a long moment. That's an admirable position, Mr. Greer. Unusual, but admirable. However, this hearing is to determine liability, not just to accept whatever blame you're willing to shoulder. I'd like to hear testimony about the medical evidence. Mrs. Doyle, would you approach the bench? Tamsin stood and walked forward. She was sworn in, gave her name and background. Thatcher watched her with obvious disdain. A mountain herbalist testifying in a legal proceeding was exactly the kind of irregular situation that annoyed lawyers like him. Mrs. Doyle, the judge, said, you were the first to identify the ergot contamination. Can you explain how you reached that diagnosis? Tamsin spoke clearly and precisely, describing the symptoms she'd seen in the mining camps, the patterns on the skin, the progression of the illness. She referenced her journals, showed sketches and documentation. She explained ergot fungus in terms the courtroom could understand. How it grew, how it contaminated grain, how the toxins affected the human body. She was compelling. Even Thatcher seemed to realize that attacking her credibility would backfire. She was too knowledgeable, too well documented, too clearly correct in her diagnosis. And you attempted to warn various parties about this contamination, the judge asked. I did. I warned Mr. Calhoun, the store owner who was selling the grain. I warned Dr. Pemberton. I warned Mr. Greer. No one believed me initially. Why do you think that was? Tamsin met the judge's eyes steadily. Because I'm a woman, without formal medical training. Because my knowledge comes from experience rather than universities. Because people tend to dismiss warnings from sources they don't respect, even when those warnings are correct. The judge nodded slowly. And yet you persisted. I'd watched 5 men die in the mining camps. I wasn't willing to watch more people die in Bellriver if I could prevent it, even though no one wanted to hear what you had to say. Especially because of that, the truth doesn't become less true just because people refuse to hear it. The words hung in the courtroom. Silas felt a surge of pride in this woman who'd stood alone against skepticism and disbelief, who'd kept fighting even when no one listened. Thatcher stood to cross-examine. Mrs. Doyle, you mentioned that you have no formal medical training. Isn't it true that you're practicing medicine without a license? I'm helping my neighbors. I don't charge set fees. I don't claim to be a licensed physician. But you are diagnosing conditions and prescribing treatments. I'm observing symptoms and offering remedies based on documented experience. That's not illegal. Dr. Pemberton disagrees with your methods. Dr. Pemberton initially disagreed with my diagnosis. He's since confirmed that I was correct. Tamzin's voice was calm but firm, and he's working with me now to treat affected patients. Our methods may differ, but our goals are the same. Thatcher tried a few more questions, but Tamsin handled each one with grace and precision. Finally, he gave up and sat down. The judge called Dr. Pemberton next. The doctor confirmed Tamzin's diagnosis, admitted he'd been wrong to dismiss her initially, verified that her treatments were effective. His testimony was grudging but honest. Then came the affected families. One by one, they testified about their symptoms, their treatments, their losses. The mill worker who'd lost 3 fingers despite Tamzin's intervention, Louisa, describing her terror when her son fell ill, and I, elderly man from the mining camps who'd lost his brother to the poisoning. Each testimony added weight to the prosecution. By midday, the evidence was overwhelming. The grain had been contaminated. People had died. Others had been permanently injured. Someone had to be held accountable. During the lunch recess, Silas sat with Tamsin in an empty office the court clerk had provided. "You were remarkable up there," he said. "I just told the truth. That's all any of us can do. It's more than that. You stood up there and claimed your expertise, defended your knowledge, refused to be dismissed. That took courage." Tamsin smiled slightly. "I learned it from watching you. The way you've admitted fault, taken responsibility, refused to hide behind lawyers and legal maneuvering. If you can be brave, so can I." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Silas reached across the table and took her hand. She didn't pull away. "When this is over," he said quietly, "when the verdict is in and the damages are paid, what happens next? For us, I mean. I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead. I have. I've been thinking about it for weeks now." He squeezed her hand gently. "I care about you, Tamsin, more than I thought I could care about anyone again, and I hope, you might feel the same." "I do," she said softly. "But Silas, this is complicated. Your late wife was someone I knew, someone I cared about. Being with you, it feels like I'm stepping into a life that was hers. You're not stepping into Catherine's life. You're creating something new with me, something neither of us expected, but both of us need." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. "I loved Catherine. I'll always love the memory of her, but she's gone, and I'm still here, still living. And I want to live fully, not just exist in the shadow of grief." Tamzin's eyes were bright with tears. "I want that too. I'm just afraid. Afraid of losing someone again, afraid of building something that might collapse. Then we'll be afraid together, and we'll build it anyway." The bailiff knocked on the door. Time to return to the courtroom for the afternoon session. Silas released Tamzin's hand reluctantly. They walked back together, not touching, but close enough to feel each other's presence. The afternoon would bring the verdict, the assignment of blame, the determination of damages. But whatever came, they'd face it together. 2 people who'd bound each other through tragedy, who'd chosen truth over comfort, who'd learned that healing meant more than just treating wounds. It meant learning to live again. The afternoon session began with the judge's careful review of all the evidence. Morrison was thorough, asking clarifying questions, requesting additional documentation, ensuring he had a complete picture of what had happened. The courtroom remained silent, except for his voice and the occasional rustle of papers. Finally, he set down his notes and looked at the assembled parties. This case presents a complex situation with multiple points of failure. Let me address each party's responsibility in turn. Hewitt leaned forward, his lawyers poised to object if necessary. Silas sat calmly, hands folded on the table. His hands still bore faint traces of the red patterns, a permanent reminder of how close he'd come to disaster. "Mr. Hewitt," the judge said, "you purchased grain that was visibly contaminated. Your lawyers argue you had no way of knowing the danger, but I find that argument unpersuasive. Any experienced grain merchant would recognize ergot sclerotia. The dark color, the abnormal density, the price point, all of these should have raised concerns. You chose to ignore those concerns because the profit margin was attractive. Thatcher stood. Your Honor, if I may, you may not. I'm delivering my findings, and I'll thank you to remain seated until I'm finished. Morrison's voice was stern. Mr. Hewitt, you are liable for knowingly distributing contaminated product. The fact that you didn't intend to poison anyone is immaterial. You were negligent in your duty to verify the safety of goods you sold. Hewitt's face went pale. His lawyers exchanged worried glances. However, the judge continued, Mr. Hewitt's negligence was compounded by failures at multiple other points in the supply chain. Mr. Greer, your railroad company contracted to inspect all grain shipments. Those inspections didn't occur. Your company accepted payment for a service it failed to provide. That constitutes breach of contract at minimum, possibly criminal negligence, depending on how the prosecutor views the matter. Silas nodded. He'd expected this. You've admitted fault and offered to pay damages from personal funds. That demonstrates character and integrity. But it doesn't erase the negligence. Morrison paused, consulting his notes. I'm also troubled by the medical community's response to this crisis. Dr. Pemberton, you're a licensed physician. When Mrs. Doyle brought her concerns to you, you dismissed them without investigation. You allowed professional prejudice to override medical judgment. That's unacceptable. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Doyle, the judge said, and Tamsin straightened slightly. You acted correctly throughout this situation. You identified the threat, documented it properly, and attempted to warn the appropriate authorities. The fact that no one listened is not your failing. It's theirs. A murmur of approval ran through the courtroom. Several of Tamsin's patients nodded. Now, as to liability and damages, Morrison picked up another document. I find Mr. Hewitt primarily liable for distributing contaminated grain. I find Mr. Greer's railroad company secondarily liable for failing to perform contracted inspections. The damages total, by my calculation, comes to $42,000. That includes medical costs, lost wages, pain and suffering, and compensation for the 3 deaths that occurred. The number hung in the air. $42,000. More than Silas had calculated, but not by much. Mr. Hewitt, you will pay $30,000. Mr. Greer, you will pay $12,000. Those payments will be distributed to affected families according to the schedule I'll provide. Payment is due within 90 days. Hewitt's lawyers immediately began conferring with their client. Silas simply nodded. $12,000 would take most of his remaining savings, but he could manage it. He'd already prepared for this outcome. Additionally, the judge said, I'm ordering both parties to implement new safety protocols. Mr. Hewitt, you will establish grain inspection procedures and hire qualified inspectors before you're permitted to sell grain again in this territory. Mr. Greer, he paused. I understand you're no longer with the railroad company? That's correct, Your Honor. I sold my shares. Then this order applies to the railroad company itself. They must establish proper inspection protocols and adhere to them strictly. The territorial government will monitor compliance. Morrison looked around the courtroom. I want to be clear about something. This tragedy was preventable. Multiple people saw warning signs and ignored them. Multiple people prioritized profit over safety. Multiple people dismissed valid concerns because they came from an unconventional source. We cannot allow that to happen again. He turned specifically to Tamsin. Mrs. Doyle, I'm formally recognizing your expertise in herbal medicine and your contribution to public health. While I cannot grant you a medical license, that's not within my authority, I can and do declare that your practice of herbal healing is legal and valuable to this community. Anyone who attempts to interfere with your work will answer to this court. Tamsin's eyes widened. It wasn't a license, but it was legitimacy. Legal recognition of her knowledge and her right to practice. More than she'd ever hoped for, this hearing is concluded. Bailiff, provide copies of my written judgment to all parties. We're adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. The courtroom erupted into conversation. People were standing, moving, talking urgently with neighbors. Silas sat very still, processing what had just happened. He'd been found liable. His company's negligence had been publicly documented. He'd have to pay $12,000. His reputation in business circles was destroyed, and he felt nothing but relief. Tamsin appeared beside him. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright with emotion. "Silas, we won," he said quietly. "Not everything we wanted, but enough. Justice got served, at least partially. The judge recognized my practice. He said it was legal and valuable." Her voice trembled slightly. "I never expected. You deserved it. You earned it through years of careful work and documentation." He stood, facing her. The courtroom was still noisy around them, but in their small corner there was a pocket of stillness. "What happens now? Now we help distribute the damages to families who need them. Now we make sure the new safety protocols actually work. Now we—" She stopped, looked at him directly. "Now we figure out what comes next. For both of us, I'd like that." They stood close together, not quite touching, surrounded by the noise and movement of the courthouse. Two people who'd found each other through tragedy, who'd fought for truth when it would have been easier to stay silent, who'd discovered that healing meant more than just treating symptoms. Louisa approached with her son. The boy tugged on Tamsin's sleeve. "Mrs. Doyle, does this mean you can stay? You won't have to go back to the mountain?" Tamsin knelt to the boy's level. "I'll always need to go back to the mountain sometimes. That's where my herbs grow, where I gather my medicines. But I won't have to stay away from town anymore. I can be here when people need me." "Good," Thomas said firmly. "Because my mama says you saved my life, and I want to say thank you proper-like." "You just did, sweetheart." Tamsin hugged the boy, then stood. Her eyes met Silas's over Thomas's head, and something passed between them. Understanding, recognition, the beginning of something neither of them could name yet, but both of them felt. Outside the courthouse, the spring afternoon was warming toward evening. People clustered in groups, discussing the verdict, the damages, what it all meant. Silas and Tamsin walked away from the crowds, toward the quieter edge of town where his house stood. Neither spoke for a long time. They were both too tired for words, too overwhelmed by everything that had happened. But the silence between them was comfortable, companionable. The silence of two people who understood each other beyond the need for constant conversation. At his gate, Tamsin paused. "I should go back to my cabin. I've been away for days, and I need to check on my herb gardens, restock my supplies. When will you be back?" 3 days. "Maybe 4, she smiled. "I'm not disappearing, Silas. I'm just going home for a bit. But I'll be back. Promise?" "Promise." She left him standing at his gate, watching as she walked toward the stable where she'd left her horse. He watched until she disappeared around the corner, then went inside his empty house. Catherine's presence was still there in the furniture. The curtains, the small touches she'd added to make the house a home. But it felt different now, less like a shrine to the past, more like a foundation for the future. He sat in the kitchen and thought about what came next. He had $12,000 to pay, a reputation to rebuild, a life to reconstruct from the ruins of his railroad career. But he also had something he hadn't had in years: hope. Tamsin returned 4 days later. Silas saw her riding into town just after dawn, her saddlebags bulging with herbs and supplies. She looked tired but peaceful, the way people look after spending time in a place that feeds their soul. She went directly to his office, the freight building that would soon belong to someone else, but that still served as a makeshift clinic for the remaining patients. 3 people waited outside, early risers who knew Tamsin kept irregular hours and wanted to catch her when she returned. Silas was already there, organizing the damage payment distribution. He'd created a list of affected families, calculated individual payments based on severity of illness and economic impact. The work was tedious but necessary. He looked up when Tamsin entered, and the smile that crossed his face was involuntary and genuine. "You came back. I said I would." She set down her bags and began unpacking. "How many patients today?" 3 so far. Miller, the mill foreman, he's still having circulation problems in his left hand. The Pratt daughter, She wants you to check her progress. And a new one, a teamster from the freight yard who thinks he might have eaten some of the bread before we destroyed it. I'll see them in order." She turned to him. "And you, how are your hands?" He held them up. The red patterns had faded to barely visible lines, like old scars. The circulation was fully restored. "Better, almost normal. Your treatment worked." Of course it did. But she took his hands anyway, checking his pulse, examining his skin with professional thoroughness. Her touch was gentle, familiar. When she released his hands, she let her fingers trail across his palm just slightly, a gesture that was more personal than medical. The patients kept them busy until midday. Miller's hand required new poultices and a stronger tincture. The Pratt daughter was healing well, nearly fully recovered. The teamster had early symptoms, caught quickly enough that treatment should work without complications. Between patients, they worked side by side in comfortable rhythm. Silas had learned enough over the past weeks to assist effectively, grinding herbs, mixing remedies, maintaining records. He'd become her unofficial assistant, and he was good at it. Careful, methodical, attentive to detail. Dr. Pemberton stopped by in the afternoon. He and Tamsin had developed a working relationship, cautious but functional. He brought a patient with a complex case, a woman with ergot poisoning complicated by diabetes. Together, they discussed treatment options, combining Pemberton's formal medical knowledge with Tamsin's herbal expertise. The collaboration was awkward at first, but gradually they found a rhythm. After Pemberton left, Tamsin turned to Silas. "I never thought I'd see the day when the town doctor consulted with me as an equal." The judge's ruling helped. Once you had legal recognition, Pemberton couldn't dismiss you anymore without looking foolish. It's more than that. He's actually listening now, actually considering that maybe there are things he doesn't know. She began cleaning her work area. People can change, even stubborn, prideful people. Speaking of change, Silas pulled out a document. "I've been thinking about what comes next. For me, my railroad days are over. I need a new direction. Have you found one?" "Maybe. I've been looking at properties on the edge of town. There's a piece of land between here and the mountains, about an hour's ride from your cabin. Good water, southern exposure, room for herb gardens and a clinic building." He showed her the property deed. "I'm thinking of buying it, setting up a proper practice. Herbs and remedies, maybe a small dispensary. A place where you could work when you're in town, where patients could come for treatment." Tamsin stared at the document. "Silas, that's a significant investment. And a complete career change. I know. But I've discovered something these past weeks. I'm good at this, at helping people, at the methodical work of mixing remedies and keeping records. And I enjoy it more than I ever enjoyed railroad speculation." He paused. "I thought if you were willing, we could do this together. Build something new, a real medical practice that combines your knowledge with, well, my organizational skills and resources. You want to become an herbalist? I want to become your partner, in whatever capacity that means." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Partner could mean many things: business associate, medical colleague, or something deeper and more personal. Tamsin set down the mortar and pestle she'd been holding. "Silas Greer, are you proposing a business partnership or something else entirely?" "Both. Either. Whatever you're ready for." He moved closer to her. "I know it's fast. I know we've only really known each other for a few weeks, but I also know that I haven't felt this certain about anything since Catherine died. You make me want to be better, want to do meaningful work. Want to build a life that matters beyond profit margins and business deals. I want that too," she said softly. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not Catherine. I won't be a traditional wife who stays home and manages your household. I have my own work, my own calling. If we do this, if we build something together, it has to be as equals. I wouldn't want it any other way. Catherine taught me that women are capable of extraordinary things, even if I was too blind to see it while she was alive. You've shown me that lesson again, more clearly." He took her hands. "I don't want a traditional marriage, Tamsin. I want a partnership with someone who challenges me, who has her own expertise and purpose. I want to build something meaningful with you." She studied his face, searching for doubt or hesitation. Found none. Then yes, let's do this. The property, the practice, the partnership, all of it. He kissed her then, gently, a promise of more to come, but restrained by the public space and the awareness that someone could walk in at any moment. When they separated, both were smiling. We'll need to plan carefully, Tamsin said, already thinking practically. The herb gardens will take time to establish. We'll need to build proper drying rooms, storage facilities, a consultation space. And we should bring in other healers, maybe train apprentices. Make this bigger than just the two of us, whatever you need. We'll build it right. Silas pulled her close again, rested his forehead against hers. Catherine would approve of this, of you, of us building something good from all this tragedy. I hope so, Tamsin whispered. I really hope so. Outside, Bellriver continued its daily rhythms. Spring was settling in, bringing warmth and growth after the hard winter. The town was healing, slowly but surely, from the poison that had nearly destroyed it. And in the small office that would soon become something new, two people stood together, planning a future neither of them had expected, but both of them wanted. Sometimes second chances came from unexpected places. Sometimes loss opened doors to possibilities you'd never considered. Sometimes the person who saved your life became the person you wanted to spend the rest of it with. And sometimes that was exactly how it was supposed to be. 6 months later, on an early autumn morning, the clinic opened its doors. The building stood exactly where Silas had envisioned it, on a gentle slope between Bellriver and the mountain country. The structure was simple but well built. Wooden frame, wide windows for light, a covered porch where patients could wait. Behind it, herb gardens stretched in neat rows, organized by plant type and medicinal use. Tamsin had spent the summer establishing them, transplanting specimens from her mountain cabin, trading with other herbalists, gathering seeds from wild places she knew. The sign above the door read, "Greer and Doyle, Herbal Remedies and Medical Consultation." Silas stood on the porch, watching the sun rise over the valley. His hands, fully healed now, the red patterns vanished except for the faintest traces, visible only in certain light, held a cup of coffee. He'd been up since before dawn, making final preparations, ensuring everything was ready. Tamsin emerged from the clinic carrying an armload of dried herb bundles. She'd been working through the night, unable to sleep from nervous excitement. Her hair was tied back simply, her dress practical for work. She looked tired and happy, and exactly where she belonged. "First patients will be here within the hour," she said. "Are you ready? Are you? I've been doing this for years. Just never with a proper clinic and a partner." She smiled at him. "Yes, I'm ready." They'd married quietly a month earlier. No big ceremony, no formal announcements. Just a simple exchange of vows in front of Judge Morrison, with Louisa and her son as witnesses. Tamsin had worn Catherine's necklace, the one with the mountain wildflower design, and Silas had given her a new ring, simple silver without ostentation. They'd moved into the small house attached to the clinic, leaving Silas's old place in town to rent. The arrangement suited them both. Tamsin still spent time at her mountain cabin, gathering herbs and maintaining the gardens there. Silas managed. The clinic operations, handled correspondence with other medical practitioners, kept meticulous records of treatments and outcomes. They worked together more than apart, but each had space for independent pursuits. Dr. Pemberton had become an unexpected ally. He referred patients regularly, consulted on difficult cases, even started learning some herbal techniques from Tamsin. The professional respect between them had deepened into genuine collaboration. Pemberton maintained his practice in town for conventional medicine, while Greer and Doyle handled herbal treatments and cases that required a different approach. The first patient arrived right on schedule, Thomas, Louisa's son, now 8 years old and completely healthy. He'd come for a routine checkup, but mostly he just liked visiting Tamsin. "Mrs. Doyle, Mrs. Greer, can I help in the gardens today?" he asked. "Mama said I could if you needed assistance." "I always need assistance," Tamsin said warmly. "After Mr. Greer examines you, you can help me harvest the echinacea. It's ready for cutting." More patients followed throughout the morning. Some from Bellriver, some from the mountain settlements, some from as far as Helena, who'd heard about the clinic through word of mouth. A woman with chronic joint pain, a man with digestive troubles, a family whose daughter had a persistent cough. Each case was different, each required careful attention. Silas had become skilled at the initial examinations, taking histories, checking vital signs, making preliminary assessments. He'd never have Tamsin's intuitive understanding of herbs and healing, but he'd developed solid fundamental skills. More importantly, he'd learned to listen to patients, to hear what they weren't saying as much as what they were. Catherine had taught him that, in a way. Her hidden past had shown him how much people carried beneath the surface. By afternoon, they'd treated a dozen patients. During a brief lull, Silas and Tamsin sat together on the porch, sharing a simple lunch of bread and cheese and apples from the tree behind the clinic. "This is good," Silas said. "Not just about the food, but about everything, the clinic, the work, the life they'd built." "It is," Tamsin agreed. She leaned against him, comfortable and content. "Better than I imagined when I first rode down to that saloon to warn you about the poisoned grain. You saved my life that day. You know that, right? If you hadn't been brave enough to confront me, to insist I listen even when I didn't want to, I'd be dead or crippled. And if you hadn't been brave enough to change your mind, to admit you were wrong and take responsibility, none of this would exist. We saved each other, Silas. That's what partnerships do." A rider approached up the path. As he drew closer, Silas recognized Mayor Hoskins. The mayor dismounted and climbed the porch steps, looking apologetic for interrupting their lunch. "Sorry to disturb you folks. I wanted to deliver this personally." He handed Silas an official-looking document. "The Territorial Medical Board has been reviewing your clinic. They're impressed with your outcomes, your record-keeping, the collaboration between herbal and conventional medicine. They're issuing you a formal certification, not quite a license, but official recognition of your practice as legitimate medical care." Tamsin took the document with trembling hands. Official recognition from the Territorial Medical Board. It was more than she'd ever hoped for, validation of everything she'd worked toward. "There's more," Hoskins continued. "They want to use your clinic as a model. They're proposing that other regions establish similar practices, combining herbal knowledge with conventional medicine. You'd be consulted on setting up these programs, training practitioners, developing protocols." Silas and Tamsin looked at each other. This was bigger than their small clinic, bigger than helping individual patients. This was a chance to change how medicine was practiced across the territory. "We'll do it," Tamsin said. "Whatever they need, we'll help." After the mayor left, they sat together in the afternoon sun, watching clouds drift across the valley. In the garden, Thomas was carefully cutting echinacea stems under the supervision of an older apprentice Tamsin had taken on. The clinic doors stood open, welcoming whoever needed help. "Sometimes I think about that first day," Silas said, "when you walked into the saloon covered in mud, and I dismissed you without a second thought. I was so certain I knew better, so convinced that your warning couldn't possibly be valid. Pride is like that. It makes us blind to truths we don't want to see. And you could have given up on me, could have let me learn the hard way what happens when you ignore good advice. Instead, you fought for me, insisted I listen, saved my life, even though I'd treated you with disrespect. That's what healers do. We help people even when they don't deserve it, even when they push us away, because the calling isn't about being appreciated or respected. It's about reducing suffering wherever we can." She took his hand, threaded her fingers through his. "Besides, I had a feeling about you. Under all that pride and stubbornness, I saw someone who could change, someone worth saving." Catherine saw that too, I think. Saw potential in me that I didn't see in myself. She pushed me to be better, even if I didn't always understand what she was doing. He lifted Tamsin's hand to his lips. "I'm grateful for both of you, for the woman I lost, who taught me about courage and reinvention. and for the woman I found, who showed me what it means to live with purpose. The sun was starting to dip toward the mountains. Soon it would be time to prepare for evening patients. There were always a few who could only come after their work was done. But for now, they sat together, two people who'd found each other through tragedy and built something beautiful from the ruins. In the distance, smoke rose from Bellriver's chimneys. The town was settling into evening routines, families gathering for dinner, businesses closing for the day. It was ordinary and peaceful, unmarked by the crisis that had nearly destroyed it months earlier. But the crisis had left its mark in other ways, in the careful inspection protocols now required for all grain shipments, in the collaboration between conventional and herbal medicine, in the recognition that wisdom could come from unexpected sources, in the understanding that listening to dismissed voices might save lives, and in this clinic, built by two people who'd learned that second chances were possible, that loss didn't have to define you, that healing meant more than just treating symptoms. Tamsin stood, stretched, and looked out at the garden she'd planted. We should harvest the rest of the echinacea before sunset, and I want to check on that new chamomile bed, make sure it's getting enough water. I'll help. Silas rose and followed her into the garden. They worked side by side as the afternoon faded into evening, their hands busy with good work, their hearts at peace with the lives they'd chosen. And on the porch of the clinic, the sign swayed gently in the breeze, announcing to anyone who cared to see that this was a place of healing, of partnership, of hope renewed. Sometimes the person who saves your life is the last person you'd ever listen to. But if you're brave enough to hear them, if you're willing to set aside pride and prejudice and fear, you might discover that they're offering more than just survival. They're offering a chance to truly live. And sometimes that's the greatest gift anyone can give.